When I first opened the door to my home and welcomed my aging parents inside, I never imagined that one day I'd be sitting in a courtroom because of it. The irony sits heavy in my chest every time I look at the family photos still hanging in the hallway. Mom smiling in her favorite cardigan, Dad giving a rare thumbs up on a summer BBQ afternoon, both of them glowing with the kind of joy that now feels fake in hindsight. At the time, it felt like the right thing to do. They were getting older, the stairs in their house had become too much, and the idea of them living alone started to gnaw at my conscience. So I told them to pack up, bring their things, and settle into the guest suite I'd spent a month renovating just for them. The first few weeks were oddly warm and nostalgic. My mother baked like it was 1998 again, filling the kitchen with the scents of cinnamon and butter, always humming some long-forgotten tune from her youth. My father, slower than he used to be but still sharp, took to organizing my garage, labeling tool drawers, and fixing anything that dared creak or rattle. I remember thinking maybe this would bring us closer, that maybe this was how families were supposed to come together after years of drifting. They called me their hero. They thanked me every night for giving them a place to feel safe. I felt like the best son in the world. But kindness has a lifespan when boundaries are invisible. And love alone doesn't stop people from taking more than they were given. It started with small things I let slide because I didn't want to seem ungrateful. My dad rearranged the living room without asking, just trying to make it more comfortable, he said, as if comfort had a universal design. My mom began sorting my laundry, which might have seemed sweet if it hadn't also involved comments about the kind of underwear I bought or how I should use more fabric softener. I brushed it off. These were just habits, I told myself. They didn't mean harm. Then my mother took over my kitchen like a tyrant ruling her domain. Suddenly, nothing was in its place. My coffee mugs disappeared to make room for her porcelain set. Spices I used for years were replaced with labeled containers from their old home. "You'll thank me later," she'd say as if I were her guest, not the homeowner. When I tried to bring it up, her smile turned brittle. "We're just helping," she snapped one evening, slamming a drawer harder than needed. "You never complained before." I stood in silence, unsure when my gratitude had become entitlement in their eyes. The real shift came when I noticed the mail. It started arriving in their names: bank statements, pension forms, and even a notice from the DMV with my address listed as theirs. Confused, I asked about it. My father looked up from his crossword and casually said, "Well, it's our address now too, isn't it?" Something in his tone chilled me. There was no discussion, no request, just a declaration. They'd planted themselves into my life like roots in concrete, slow but unyielding. I started locking my bedroom door at night, unsure why, just a gut, feeling that something was unraveling. By month 4, we were barely speaking. Passive aggression turned into open jabs. My father complained loudly about how some people just don't appreciate their parents, while my mother sighed theatrically. Every time I walked in the room, like I'd ruined the air just by being in it. I tried to talk to them. I tried to remind them that this was supposed to be mutual, built on love and respect. But all I got in return were cold stares and whispered conversations behind closed doors. I felt like a stranger in my own home, tiptoeing around people I once called family. And then the letter came. Thick envelope, gold embossed seal, their names at the top. It was a legal notice, stating that they were claiming tenancy rights, demanding protection from unlawful eviction, and citing emotional distress caused by my inconsistent behavior as justification. I dropped the letter on the kitchen floor and stared at the spot for a long time, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. My parents were suing me for trying to live in peace in my own house. That night I sat in the dark living room, the one they'd redecorated to their liking, and tried to remember the last time I felt like I belonged in it. I couldn't. The walls felt foreign, like a museum display of someone else's life. My home had become a battlefield, and I wasn't sure when I'd lost control. But one thing was painfully clear. The people who raised me, who once kissed my scraped knees and sang me to sleep, now saw me not as a son, but as a threat to the life they wanted. The days after the letter were filled with a silence so thick it felt alive, pressing against my chest every time I entered a room. I couldn't look at them the same. Every glance from my mother felt like a rehearsed performance, her eyes suddenly wide with victimhood, her tone exaggerated and trembling whenever I said anything at all. My father, once stern but fair, now looked at me with smug detachment, like a man who believed he had already won something. I stopped eating in the kitchen. I avoided the living room. I stayed in my room longer than I ever had before, headphones in, hoping that if I ignored the chaos long enough, it would somehow dissolve into peace. It didn't. I spoke to a lawyer. I didn't want to, but I had to. Her voice was calm but clipped, her words sharp with legal precision that only heightened the sense of betrayal curdling in my stomach. Unfortunately, she said as she adjusted her glasses, this is more common than you think. Family members asserting tenant rights without a formal lease, once they've been there for over 30 days, it becomes a civil matter. I remember staring at her, disbelief radiating through me like static. But they're my parents, I muttered. She nodded, her face softening only slightly. And now they're your legal adversaries. It was a sentence I never thought I'd hear. Not in this life. Not in any version of reality I'd imagined for myself. I left her office with a folder of printed options, none of which offered relief. Every choice led to confrontation, to courtrooms, to drawn-out procedures where I'd have to sit across from the people who gave me life and argue that they no longer belonged in it. My hands shook when I got home. I stood at the front door for 10 minutes before I opened it, praying I could walk in and find some version of normal. Instead, I found my father watching TV in my chair, his feet up on the ottoman I bought, eating from the last box of cookies I liked. He didn't even look at me when he said, "You were out late. Your lawyer friend keeping you busy?" It was the first time I truly hated him. That night, I tried again to talk. It was almost midnight. The house was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of lavender, my mother's diffuser running in the hallway. I knocked on their door like a tenant asking permission, and my mother opened it wearing the pink robe I gave her 2 Christmases ago. "We need to talk," I whispered, my throat tight. "Please." She stepped aside without a word, letting me in like a stranger at a hotel. My father was already in bed, glasses on, reading a paperback thriller like nothing was wrong. I stood there and laid it all out. How this wasn't what I wanted. How I only offered them a home, not a hostile takeover. How they had overstepped every boundary and twisted my generosity into ownership. My voice cracked when I said I loved them, that all I ever wanted was to help, that they were tearing apart the last shred of what made us a family. My mother sat, silently, arms crossed. My father looked up from his book, and for a moment I thought I saw something shift in his expression. Regret, maybe. But then he closed the book gently, placed it on the nightstand, and said, "You made us feel like guests. This is your consequence." I left the room before I screamed. The days that followed felt like living in a pressure cooker. Every interaction became an act of theater. My mother wore sadness like perfume, sighing loudly in the hallway, dabbing at invisible tears whenever I passed. My father got bolder, inviting old friends over and introducing the house as ours, like we were some happy trio making it work. I stopped inviting people over. I stopped speaking unless absolutely necessary. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. When the official court summons arrived, it felt like a final nail, cold and metallic. The words were there in black and white. Petition for residential possession, listing grievances that read like fiction. Defendant exhibits erratic behavior. Creates a hostile environment. Threatens emotional well-being. I sat on the floor with the paper in my hand, my back against the wall, and felt a numbness spread through my limbs. This was beyond anything I knew how to navigate. It was betrayal sculpted into paragraphs and stamped by the state. I didn't sleep that night. I watched the shadows in my room stretch and shrink, listened to the creak of footsteps outside my door, wondering if they were listening too. I kept thinking of childhood birthdays, of late-night lullabies, of my mother holding my face in her hands and telling me I was her miracle. Was that all real? Or had I dreamed a softer past into existence to survive the present? The first court date arrived on a rainy Thursday that seemed almost too fitting. Gray skies stretched endlessly overhead, and water streamed down the windshield as I sat in my car outside the courthouse, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing left in my world. I couldn't move. My body was locked in place, mind spinning with the unreality of it all. Inside that brick building, I would have to answer questions about why I wanted my parents, the people who raised me, out of my house. I would have to defend myself as if I were a villain in their story. When I finally walked inside, everything smelled like floor polish and paper. The courtroom itself was colder than I expected, sterile and stiff, with its wooden benches and tired-looking judge seated at the front like a weary referee to a match no one should ever have to witness. My parents were already there. My mother wore a charcoal gray suit, her silver hair pinned back neatly, face pale but determined. My father was beside her, arms folded, his jaw set in that same stubborn way he used to get when I refused to clean my room as a kid. But this wasn't a chore. This was war. Their lawyer spoke first, weaving a narrative so foreign it made me feel like I was watching a movie where I'd been cast as the antagonist. He described me as unstable, emotionally volatile, prone to unprovoked outbursts, and coercive control. He painted a picture of two elderly parents living in fear of their own son, afraid to speak up, walking on eggshells in a home they were invited into under false pretenses. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue as he spoke. My father nodded solemnly, playing the part of the disappointed patriarch perfectly. When my lawyer stood to respond, her voice was steady but sharp, like glass under pressure. She presented texts, photos, even emails where I had clearly extended the offer to help, the receipts of renovations done for their comfort, the timeline that showed when things had shifted, from peace to manipulation. She spoke of boundaries crossed, of a son trying to do the right thing, now being punished for doubt. I watched the judge's eyes flick back and forth, impassive but attentive, and wondered what he saw when he looked at me. A man betrayed? Or just another participant in a dysfunctional family feud? The hearing ended in a temporary ruling. No eviction yet, no judgment granted. More time was needed, more evidence to be reviewed. The next court date was scheduled for a month later. I left the building with my coat soaked and my heart hollow. My parents didn't say a word to me as they exited the opposite side. My mother wouldn't even look at me. My father just stared past me like I wasn't real. When I got home, I stood in the foyer for a long time, dripping rainwater onto the hardwood floor. The silence in the house was oppressive, almost mocking. I walked down the hall and found that they had moved some of their things again. My artwork was gone from the wall, replaced with a family portrait from 10 years ago. I stood in front of it, staring into the younger versions of us. We looked so happy, so full of promise. I wanted to reach into that frame and warn myself. Spent the following weeks in a fog. I took pictures of everything, my room, the kitchen, even the backyard. My lawyer said we'd need documentation of every change they made, every overstep. I felt like a detective in my own house, photographing evidence, keeping a journal of their words, their habits, the way my father took to opening my mail, and my mother spoke to me like I was an intruder. They never stopped pretending to be the victims, and in doing so, they became masters of erasing the line between illusion and truth. They left dishes in the sink and blamed me. They rearranged furniture and said I was losing my memory. Every day was gaslight theater. I remember one evening, clear as a scar, when I caught my mother in my office going through my file cabinet. When I demanded to know what she was doing, she clutched a folder to her chest and said, "You're not well. We're just trying to protect you from yourself." It was the moment I realized they weren't just trying to stay. They were trying to control the narrative, to paint me as someone incapable, unstable, so that they could justify everything they'd done. I was watching the death of reason in real time. A week before the second hearing, I received a letter slipped under my door. Not typed, handwritten, my mother's cursive. It said, "We still love you, but you've made your choices. Now we have to make ours." I read it 3 times before tearing it into pieces and flushing it down the toilet. Love, real love, doesn't twist the knife with such politeness. The house felt colder after that. Not from the weather, but from the atmosphere itself, as if some unseen cord that once tethered us together had snapped, and the air between us now hummed with quiet warfare. Meals were eaten separately, doors stayed shut, words were weapons, and silence was worse. When the day of the second hearing arrived, I no longer felt like a son. I felt like a plaintiff in a custody battle where the child was my own sanity, and I wasn't sure who would win. The morning of the final hearing was eerily calm. I woke before the alarm, bathed in a pale blue light filtering through the blinds. For the first time in months, my body wasn't shaking, and my hands were steady as I buttoned my shirt. It felt like stepping into armor. Something had shifted in me. I wasn't just trying to defend myself anymore. I was done begging for peace. I was ready to reclaim my life. Courtroom 3 was colder than I remembered. My parents were already seated when I arrived, dressed again in that coordinated, subdued way. Presentable grief made flesh. They didn't acknowledge me. My mother clutched a leather-bound journal in her lap, her lips pinched. My father leaned slightly toward their lawyer, whispering something that made the attorney nod. It was like watching strangers imitate people I used to know. The judge began with a review of new materials. My lawyer had submitted everything: photos, text transcripts, recordings from inside the house. One in particular played aloud in the room. My father declaring, "You owe us this much after all we've done," followed by my mother saying, "You don't get to change your mind now. We live here too." The courtroom didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The silence that followed was its own kind of echo. Their lawyer tried to recover. He leaned into emotion, spinning a tale of elderly vulnerability, of confusion, of a well-intentioned couple bewildered by their son's mental decline. When I heard those words, I looked straight at my father. He looked back, and then away. Cowardice in real time. Then came my turn to speak. I stood up slowly, heart pounding but voice clear. I talked about what it had meant to offer them my home, the hope I had that we'd find closeness again. I told the court how I turned a guest room into a haven, how I handed them keys not knowing I was unlocking a door to my own erasure. I described the transformation, from quiet gratitude to invasion, from love to manipulation. And then I said it plainly. My parents didn't just move in, they took over, and they've been trying to erase me from my own life ever since. There was a pause after that. No objection, no sound. Just the soft creak of the judge's chair as he leaned forward, fingers steepled beneath his chin. He asked a few final questions, brief and direct. Then he said he would issue his decision by the end of the day. I walked out feeling like I had just crawled through fire. Not victorious, but scorched, charred and barely breathing. My lawyer patted my back gently, her expression unreadable. "You did everything you could," she whispered. And in that moment, it didn't feel like enough. I drove home in silence. The house waited for me like an unfinished sentence, still full of their presence. I sat in the driveway, staring at the windows. My whole life had played out in those walls. Childhood laughter, adolescent rebellion, adult loneliness, all of it echoed there. And now it had become a battleground. That afternoon, the email came. The court finds in favor of the defendant. The plaintiffs have no legal claim to residency and must vacate the premises within 30 days. I read the sentence over and over again. I didn't cry. I didn't laugh. I just stared. The war was over, and I wasn't sure who I was without it. When I got inside, the house was quiet. My parents were in their room, my guest room. I knocked once. My mother opened the door and looked at me like she had aged a decade. I handed her the printed notice. She took it with trembling hands. "So that's it?" she asked, voice smaller than I remembered. "You're kicking us out?" "No," I said, my throat tight. "You left a long time ago." They moved out in silence. No arguments, no final speeches. They packed their things over the course of 2 weeks, slowly, as if dragging time behind them. I came home one day to find them gone. No goodbye. No letter. Just an empty guest room and a house that finally felt mine again. But the relief didn't come easily. I spent weeks walking through the rooms like I was visiting a crime scene, everything familiar but haunted. I boxed up the family photos. I changed the locks. I burned a candle in every room, as if light could bleach the shadows they'd left behind. Healing didn't look the way I thought it would. It wasn't cathartic, it was quiet, lonely. Some nights I missed them, not the people they were at the end, but the ones I'd hoped they still were. The ones who read bedtime stories, who danced in the kitchen, who called me their miracle. I haven't spoken to them since. Friends ask if I'll ever try to fix things. I tell them some things break in ways that aren't meant to be mended. I still love them, in the way a scar remembers pain, but also survival. And sometimes I walk down the hallway, past the guest room, and I pause, not out of anger or regret, but because that room will always be the place where love met its limit, and where I finally learned mine.